Captain Ryan Torres stood in the command center of his warship, staring at the holographic display that showed enemy movement patterns across 3 star systems, and his fingers traced the path of a small vessel that intelligence had flagged as belonging to Luminary royalty. And after 15 years of fighting these alien elves, he finally had a chance to capture one of their leaders alive. The bridge crew worked silently around him, and everyone knew what this mission meant to their captain, because Ryan had lost everything to the Luminary, and his entire colony had been reduced to ash when he was just 23 years old. And now at 38, he commanded one of humanity's most feared warships, and devoted every waking moment to making the elves pay for what they had done. Lieutenant Karen Mills approached with a datapad and reported that scout ships had confirmed the target's location, and the Luminary princess was traveling with only 2 dragon escorts, which was unusually light security for someone of her rank, and this might be their only opportunity to strike before she reached the safety of her home world. Ryan felt his heart rate increase as he processed this information, and he had dreamed of this moment for so long that it almost felt unreal. And finally he would have leverage against the Luminary Empire, and finally he could make them feel the pain of loss that had haunted him for 15 years. Set an intercept course, he ordered, and his voice was cold and steady despite the emotions swirling inside his chest, and prepare all weapon systems. And I want those dragons neutralized the moment we drop out of hyperspace. The crew responded with practiced efficiency, and Ryan watched as his ship accelerated toward the target coordinates, and the stars outside the viewport stretched into lines of light as they entered faster than light travel, and within minutes they would be face to face with their prey. He thought about the day his world died and remembered running through burning streets searching for his family, while dragonfire rained down from the sky, and the Luminary had shown no mercy to the civilians below, and children and elderly people had burned alongside soldiers, and Ryan had survived only because he had been off-world visiting a friend. The guilt of surviving when everyone he loved had died was something he carried every single day, and it fueled his hatred and drove him forward when exhaustion threatened to break him, and now that hatred would finally serve its purpose. The ship dropped out of hyperspace, and the tactical display immediately lit up with contacts, and there was the small Luminary vessel exactly where intelligence said it would be, and circling it like celestial guardians were 2 massive dragons whose scales shimmered with colors that seemed to shift between gold and violet. Target acquired his weapons, officer announced, and waiting for your command. Sir Ryan stared at the dragons and felt ancient rage burning in his chest. And these creatures had killed so many humans and destroyed so many worlds, and they deserved no mercy. Fire, he commanded, and his voice cut through the bridge like a knife. The warship's main cannons unleashed streams of plasma that lit up the darkness of space, and the first dragon tried to dodge, but the targeting systems were too accurate, and the blast caught it in the side and sent it spinning away, trailing sparks of what looked like stardust. The second dragon roared, and the sound transmitted through their ship sensors made everyone on the bridge flinch, and it charged directly at them, breathing a stream of cosmic fire that splashed harmlessly against their shields. Fire again, Ryan ordered, and another volley struck the charging dragon and knocked it backward, and both creatures now floated in space, unconscious or dead, and Ryan did not care which. The Luminary vessel tried to flee, but it was a civilian craft with no weapons and minimal engines, and Ryan's warship caught it easily in a tractor beam and began pulling it toward the cargo bay. Get a security team ready, Ryan said, and I want the prisoner brought to holding cell 3, and do not harm her unless she resists, and she is worth more to us alive than dead. He left the bridge and made his way down to the cargo bay, where armed soldiers already waited in formation, and the massive doors of the airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and everyone raised their weapons as the captured ship's door began to open. Ryan expected to see a proud warrior or a defiant noble, but what emerged was something he had not prepared for, and the Luminary princess was tall and graceful with silver hair that flowed past her waist like liquid moonlight, and her skin had a faint luminescence that made her seem to glow from within. Her eyes were the most striking feature, and they were large and almond-shaped and colored like amethysts, and they held an expression of pure terror as she saw the weapons pointed at her face, and she raised her hand slowly to show she was unarmed. Her clothing was simple and elegant, and flowing robes of white and silver that marked her as royalty, but held none of the military bearing he expected, and she looked more like a diplomat or scholar than a warrior. Princess. Princess Melody, Ryan said, and using the name from his intelligence files, and you are now a prisoner of the Human Federation, and you will cooperate fully or face the consequences. The princess looked directly at him, and her glowing eyes seemed to see through his armor and his anger, and straight into the damaged soul beneath, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, and instead tears began streaming down her face, and they glowed softly like liquid starlight. Take her away, Ryan commanded, and he turned his back, because looking at her was making him uncomfortable in ways he could not explain. The soldiers escorted her toward the holding cells, and Ryan stood alone in the cargo bay and wondered why seeing her cry had affected him, when he had sworn never to feel sympathy for any luminary ever again. He walked slowly back toward his quarters and past crew members who congratulated him on the successful capture, and he accepted their praise mechanically, and his mind was somewhere else entirely. In his quarters, he pulled up the intelligence files on Princess Melody and began reading through her history, and she was the youngest, daughter of the Luminary Emperor and only 26 years old. And according to reports, she had never served in the military and had spent most of her life studying ancient texts and advocating for peace. That last part made Ryan pause, and he read it again to make sure he understood correctly. And apparently Princess Melody had been speaking out against the war for years, and she had given speeches calling for negotiations, and had even defied her father by refusing to support certain military campaigns. He scrolled through more files and found recordings of her speeches, and in one she spoke passionately about the need for understanding between species, and about how violence only created more violence, and about how the Luminari and humans were more alike than different. Ryan closed the file and rubbed his face with both hands, and he did not want to see her as anything other than the enemy, and he did not want to know that she had been working for peace while he had been working for war, but the information was there and he could not ignore it. And worse yet, he found a mission report that made his blood run cold. Princess Melody had been traveling to a neutral space station to meet with human diplomats, and she was supposed to begin peace negotiations that could have ended the war. Ryan had just captured and possibly destroyed the one Luminari who was actively trying to stop the fighting. He sat in silence for a long time, and his hands were shaking, and 15 years of certainty were crumbling around him, and he had been so sure that all Luminari were evil and that they all deserved to die for what they had done to his people. But what if he was wrong, and what if the princess crying in his holding cell was exactly what she appeared to be, and an innocent person trying to make things better? He stood up and walked toward the holding cells, and he needed to see her again, and needed to look into those strange glowing eyes and determine for himself whether she was telling the truth or playing some elaborate game. When he reached holding cell 3, he found her sitting on the metal bench with her head bowed and her silver hair falling forward to hide her face, and she did not look up when the door opened, and did not acknowledge his presence at all. "Why do you hate us so much?" she asked quietly, and her voice was musical even when filled with sadness. Ryan wanted to rage at her and wanted to list all the crimes her people had committed, but instead he found himself saying, "You destroyed my home, and everyone I loved died because of your people." Melody finally looked up, and her face was wet with glowing tears, and her eyes held such genuine sorrow that it made his chest ache, and she whispered, "I'm sorry for what was done to you, and I am sorry for every life lost in this terrible war, and I have never killed anyone. And I have spent my entire life trying to stop this and trying to make my people see that there is another way." Ryan stared at her and searched for any sign of deception but found none, and he turned and walked away before she could say anything else because he was not ready to face what her words might mean. Ryan Torres could not sleep that night, and every time he closed his eyes he saw Princess Melody's glowing tears and heard her voice saying she had never killed anyone, and he had spent 15 years believing that all Luminari were murderers, and now his certainty was being challenged by one crying alien in his holding cell. He got out of bed and went to his personal computer terminal and began searching through classified databases for information about the attack on his colony. And he had never questioned the official reports before because his grief and rage had been too overwhelming. But now he needed to know the truth. The files showed that the Luminary fleet had appeared without warning and opened fire on the colony's defensive, installations and then proceeded to burn the entire settlement. An official report stated that it was a deliberate massacre, meant to terrorize humanity into surrender. But as Ryan dug deeper, he found something that made his stomach turn, and there was a buried intelligence report, suggesting that the Luminary had believed the colony was a hidden military base, and that all civilians had been evacuated weeks before. The report stated that human forces had been using civilian colonies as cover for military operations, and that the Luminary had intercepted communications suggesting the base was operational and fully staffed with soldiers. Ryan read the report 3 times, and each time he felt his understanding of the war shifting beneath his feet. And if this was true, then the attack on his home had been a terrible mistake based on false intelligence, and not the deliberate slaughter he had believed it to be. He thought about all the missions he had led and all the Luminary ships he had destroyed and all the lives he had taken in the name of revenge, and how many of those had been innocent people who were just as much victims of this war as he was. The question haunted him until dawn, and when morning came, he found himself walking back to the holding cells, and he needed answers, and needed to understand how this war had spiraled so far out of control. Melody was awake and sitting in the same position as before, and she looked up when he entered, and her eyes were red from crying, but they still held that strange inner light. "Tell me about your people," Ryan said without preamble, "and tell me the truth about this war." Melody studied him for a long moment, and then began to speak, and her voice was soft but steady, and she told him about the Luminary homeworld, and about a society built on art and music and scholarship, and about a people who had never wanted war, but had been drawn into it through fear and misunderstanding. She explained that the Luminary had first encountered humans near the border of their territory, and that early contacts had been peaceful, and both species had been curious about each other and eager to learn. But then there had been an incident, and a human trading vessel had exploded near a Luminary station, and hundreds of Luminary had died, and human officials claimed it was an accident. But Luminary investigators found evidence suggesting it was a deliberate attack. The Luminary government had demanded answers, and humans had refused to take responsibility, and tensions had escalated, and soon both sides were seeing threats where none existed, and preparing for war that neither truly wanted. When fighting finally broke out, both sides committed terrible acts, and the Luminary had bombed what they thought were military targets only to discover they had killed civilians. And humans had destroyed Luminary colony ships they believed were carrying weapons, but were actually filled with refugees. The cycle of violence had fed on itself, and each atrocity had justified the next, and soon no one remembered who had struck first or why they were fighting, and they only knew that the other side was the enemy and had to be destroyed. Ryan listened and felt something breaking inside his chest, and he had spent 15 years hating the Luminary and believing they were monsters who deserved extinction. And now he was learning that they were just people who had made mistakes and been caught in the same cycle of fear and revenge that had consumed him. "What about your dragons?" he asked, and changing the subject because it was too painful to think about all the wasted years. Melody's face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and she said, "My dragons are dying, and I can feel them fading, and they are bonded to my soul, and when they die, part of me will die with them." "What does that mean?" Ryan asked. "Luminary royalty are bonded to dragons from birth," she explained, "and the dragons choose us when we are children, and we grow together and share emotions and thoughts, and they are not pets or weapons, and they are our companions and our family. And losing them is like losing part of yourself." Ryan remembered the 2 dragons floating in space after his weapons had struck them down, and he had assumed they were just animals or war beasts. But now he understood they were intelligent beings who had been protecting someone they loved. "Where are they now?" he asked. Melody looked at him with desperate hope in her eyes, and they fell into the void when your weapons hit them, and they are drifting somewhere in space, and if someone could find them and bring them to a healing station, they might survive. But every moment that passes makes it less likely. How long do they have? Ryan asked. "Hours," she whispered, "and maybe a day at most. And after that the bond will break and they will be gone forever." Ryan made a decision that he knew his crew would not understand, and he stood up and said, "I will find them." Melody stared at him in shock. "And why would you help me, and you hate my people?" "Maybe I was wrong," Ryan said, and the words felt strange in his mouth. but also somehow right, and maybe this whole war has been wrong from the beginning. He left the cell and returned to the bridge, and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Karen Mills, looked surprised to see him. "So early, I need you to organize a search pattern," Ryan said, "and we are looking for 2 luminary dragons that were hit during yesterday's engagement." Karen stared at him like he had lost his mind. "And sir, we need to focus on our mission, and recovering enemy creatures is not a priority." "It is now," Ryan said firmly, "and deploy all available shuttles and scan the area where we engage the target, and those dragons need to be found within the next few hours." But Sir Karen began. "That is an order," Ryan said, and his tone left no room for argument. The crew scrambled to comply, and within minutes, shuttles were launching and beginning systematic sweeps of the surrounding space, and Ryan stood at the tactical display and watched their progress and silently willing them to find the dragons before it was too late. 3 hours passed, and Ryan felt tension building in his shoulders, and the search area was vast, and the dragons could be anywhere, and they might already be dead. Then one of the shuttle pilots reported a contact, and they had found something large drifting near an asteroid field, and it matched the description of a luminary dragon. "Get a recovery team there immediately," Ryan ordered, "and be careful and treat it as if it were one of our own." Wounded 30 minutes later, the first dragon was secured in the cargo bay, and medical teams were working to stabilize it, and its scales were dull and lifeless, and its breathing was shallow, but it was alive. The second dragon was found an hour later, and it was in worse condition, but still clinging to life, and both creatures were moved to the medical bay, where human doctors worked frantically to save them using medical data that Ryan had pulled from luminary databases. He went to the holding cell and told Melody what they had found, and her reaction was immediate and overwhelming, and she stood up so fast she almost fell and begged him to let her see them. Ryan hesitated, and then decided that she deserved to be with her companions, and he had the guards escort her to the medical bay under heavy supervision. When Melody entered the medical bay and saw her dragons lying on the treatment tables, she made a sound that was half sob and half song, and she rushed to their sides and placed her hands on their scales. The dragons stirred at her touch, and their eyes flickered open, and they made soft rumbling sounds that seemed to vibrate through the entire room, and Melody pressed her forehead against each of them in turn, and whispered words in her own language that Ryan could not understand, but felt the meaning of anyway. The medical team reported that both dragons would recover, given time and proper care, and Melody turned to Ryan with tears streaming down her face, and these were not tears of sorrow, but of joy and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "And you did not have to do this, and I know. You hate my people, but you saved them anyway." And why Ryan looked at her and at the dragons and at his crew members who were watching this scene with confused expressions, and he realized he did not have a good answer, because it was the right thing to do, he said finally. And maybe that is reason enough. Over the next several days, Melody stayed in the medical bay with her dragons, and Ryan found himself visiting more often than necessary, and he told himself it was to check on their recovery. But truthfully, he was drawn by something he could not name. They talked during those visits, and Melody told him stories about growing up in the Luminary Palace, and about learning to fly with Sky and Star when they were all just younglings, and about her studies of ancient philosophy and her dreams of peace. Ryan found himself sharing his own stories, and he told her about his childhood on the colony, and about his family, and about the man he had been before the war had turned him into something cold and angry. 1 week after the dragons had been brought aboard Ryan's warship, he found himself sitting in the medical bay watching Melody sing to her companions, and her voice filled the room with sounds that seemed to come from another world entirely, and the dragons responded by humming deep in their chests, creating harmonies that made the air vibrate. Sky, the larger dragon, had recovered enough to lift his head, and his scales had regained their shimmering quality that shifted between gold and deep purple, and Star, the smaller dragon, was still weak, but her eyes were bright and alert as she listened to Melody's song. Ryan had never imagined that dragons could be so gentle, and he had spent years thinking of them as weapons of destruction, but watching them nuzzle against Melody and seeing the obvious love between them had changed something fundamental in his understanding. The medical staff had grown fond of the dragons too, and Dr. Lisa Chen reported that both creatures were highly intelligent and responsive to treatment, and she had even started learning some basic luminary words so she could communicate with Melody more effectively. Lieutenant Karen Mills had been less enthusiastic about the situation, and she had pulled Ryan aside multiple times to question his decisions, and the crew was confused about why they were caring for enemy creatures, and some were openly hostile to the idea of showing kindness to any luminary. Ryan had defended his choice each time, and he explained that these dragons were innocent beings who had only been defending their companion, and that treating them with cruelty would make humans no better than the enemy they claimed to fight. But he knew the real reason he had saved them had nothing to do with military strategy or moral philosophy, and he had done it because seeing Melody's tears had broken through the armor of hate he had built around his heart, and for the first time in 15 years he had felt something other than rage. That realization terrified him, and he had spent his entire adult life devoted to revenge, and if he let go of his hatred, what would be left and who would he be without the mission that had defined him for so long? He was sitting with these thoughts when Melody approached him and asked if they could talk privately, and Ryan nodded and led her to a small observation room where they could see the stars stretching endlessly outside the viewport. "Thank you again for saving Sky and Star," Melody said, and her glowing eyes were fixed on his face. "And I know this has been difficult for you, and I know you are struggling with what you have learned." Ryan wanted to deny it, but found he could not lie to her, and she seemed to see through every defense he tried to raise, and instead he said, "Everything I believed about your people is wrong, and I have spent 15 years fighting a war based on lies and misunderstanding, and I do not know what to do with that knowledge." Melody moved closer, and her presence was calming in a way he could not explain, and she said, "You can choose to continue fighting, or you can choose to work for peace, and the past cannot be changed, but the future is still being written. How can I work for peace?" Ryan asked, and his voice was bitter. "And I have killed so many of your people, and I have led missions that destroyed luminary ships and colonies, and my hands are covered in blood." Melody reached out and took both of his hands in hers, and her touch sent warmth spreading through his body, and she said, "My hands are not clean either, and I am the daughter of the Emperor who ordered attacks on human worlds, and I carry the guilt of every luminary who has committed violence in this war. But I choose to believe that redemption is possible, and that we can break the cycle if we have the courage to try." Ryan looked down at their joined hands and noticed how different they were, and his were scarred and calloused from years of combat, while hers were smooth and glowing with that strange inner light, and yet in this moment they felt perfectly matched. "What were you trying to do before I captured you?" he asked. Melody sighed and explained that she had arranged secret meetings with human diplomats who also wanted peace, and they were going to meet at a neutral station and begin negotiations that could have led to a ceasefire, and eventually a treaty. Ryan felt guilt wash over him, and he had destroyed that opportunity when he attacked her ship, and because of his actions, peace talks that might have saved thousands of lives had been cancelled. "We can still make it happen," Melody said, as if reading his thoughts. "And you could take me to that station, and you could speak on behalf of humans who want peace, and your testimony would carry weight because you are a decorated war hero who has fought the luminary for 15 years. You want me to become a peacemaker," Ryan said, and the idea seemed absurd. "I want you to become who you were always meant to be," Melody replied, "and before the war turned you into something you are not. And I can see the good man you were underneath all the anger, and I believe that man still exists and is ready to emerge." Ryan wanted to argue, but the words would not come, and he realized that part of him desperately wanted to believe she was right and wanted to believe he could be something other than a weapon pointed at her. People. Over the next few days, Ryan began reviewing all the intelligence reports he could access about the war, and he looked at them with new eyes, and without the filter of hate that had colored his perception for so long. What he found disturbed him deeply, and there were patterns of deception on both sides, and military leaders who seemed more interested in continuing the war than winning it, and politicians who profited from weapons manufacturing, while soldiers died in pointless battles. He found evidence of war crimes committed by human forces and villages burned, and prisoners tortured and civilians killed, and he had known about some of these incidents, but had justified them as necessary actions against a monstrous enemy. Now he saw them for what they were, and atrocities that had fed the cycle of violence, and given the Luminari every reason to hate humanity, just as much as humans hated them. He also found reports of Luminary officers who had refused to follow orders to attack civilian targets, and of entire units that had deserted rather than participate in massacres, and there were even records of secret communications between low-ranking officers on both sides who were trying to arrange local ceasefires. The war was not as simple as he had believed, and both sides contained good people and evil. People, and most people were somewhere in between, just trying to survive in a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Ryan called a meeting with his senior officers and told them what he had learned, and he explained that he was considering taking Princess Melody to the neutral station to restart peace negotiations. The reaction was explosive, and Lieutenant Karen Mills stood up and accused him of betraying everything they had fought for, and several other officers agreed, and they said that Melody had clearly brainwashed him, and that he was putting emotions ahead of duty. But others were quieter and more thoughtful, and Dr. Lisa Chen said she had been having doubts about the war for years, and Commander Jeff Martinez admitted that he was tired of killing and wanted to believe there could be another way. The meeting ended without consensus, and Ryan's authority as captain meant his decision would stand, but he knew he had created division among his crew, and some of them would never forgive him for what they saw as weakness. That night Melody found him in the observation room staring out at the stars, and she sat beside him in comfortable silence for several minutes before speaking. "You are losing the support of your crew," she said softly. "Some of them," Ryan agreed, but others are starting to question the war, and that is all I can ask for." "What if we fail?" Melody asked. "And what if we go to this station and no one listens? And what if the war continues anyway?" "Then, at least we tried," Ryan said. "And at least we chose to stand for something other than hatred, and that has to count for something." Melody leaned her head against his shoulder, and Ryan was surprised by how natural it felt. And they had been enemies just weeks ago, and now she was the person he trusted most in the universe. "Sky and Star are strong enough to travel now," Melody said, "and we could leave tomorrow, if you are ready." Ryan thought about what he was giving up, and his command, and his reputation, and the respect of many of his crew, and he thought about the 15 years he had spent consumed by rage and hatred. "I am ready," he said, "and it is time to stop fighting and start building something better." The next morning, Ryan made an announcement to the entire ship, and he explained that they would be escorting Princess Melody to the neutral station, and that he would be participating in peace negotiations. Some crew members cheered and others looked angry or betrayed, and Lieutenant Karen Mills requested a transfer to another ship, and Ryan granted it because he understood her feelings even if he no longer shared them. Dr. Lisa Chen volunteered to accompany them as a medical representative, and Commander Jeff Martinez offered to pilot the shuttle that would take them to the station, and several other crew members asked to come along and help, however they could. Ryan realized that he was not alone in his desire for peace, and there were others who had been waiting for someone to give them permission to hope. As they prepared to leave, Melody asked Ryan what he would say to the human diplomats and how he would convince them to give peace a chance. Ryan thought about all the people he had lost and all the lives he had taken and all the years he had wasted on revenge. The neutral station appeared on their view screen like a massive wheel spinning slowly in the darkness of space, and it was a joint construction built by several species who had no stake in the human-luminary conflict, and served as a place where diplomats could meet without fear of attack. Ryan felt his pulse quicken as their shuttle approached the docking bay, and this was the moment that would determine whether his decision had been brave or foolish, and whether peace was possible, or if the war would continue until one species was destroyed. Melody sat beside him looking calm and composed, but he noticed her hands were trembling slightly, and Sky and Star were pressed close to her, radiating protective energy, and they had grown even more magnificent during their recovery, and their scales now shone with inner light that filled the shuttle with gentle radiance. Dr. Lisa Chen checked her medical supplies one more time, and Commander Jeff Martinez ran through the docking procedures, and everyone was tense and excited and terrified all at once. Station control gave them permission to dock, and the shuttle settled into its berth with a soft thump, and Ryan took a deep breath and stood up and gestured for the others to follow on too. Station's interior was unlike anything Ryan had seen before, and it was designed to accommodate multiple species, and the corridors were wide and the ceilings high, and the air had a strange sweet smell that came from the alien plants growing in. Gardens along the walls. They were met by a delegation of Zentari who were a tall, blue-skinned species known for their diplomatic skills, and the lead Zentari introduced himself as Ambassador Korvax and explained that representatives from both human and Luminari governments had agreed to attend preliminary peace talks. However, Korvax warned them that many on both sides were skeptical, and that hardliners opposed any negotiation and saw it as weakness, and the atmosphere would be hostile, and they should be prepared for resistance. Ryan nodded and said he had expected nothing less and that people who profited from war would always oppose peace. They were escorted to a conference room where about 20 beings waited, and half were human, diplomats and military officers, and the other half were Luminari nobles and counselors, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ryan recognized several of the humans, including Admiral Patricia Foster, who had been one of his early commanding officers, and General Marcus Cole, who was known for his aggressive tactics against the Luminari, and both looked at him with expressions of disgust and betrayal. On the Luminari side, he saw Princess Melody's older brother, Prince Aldrich, who glared at his sister with cold fury, and several elderly counselors who whispered among themselves and pointed at the dragons with obvious displeasure. Ambassador Korvax called the meeting to order and explained that they would hear testimony from Captain Ryan Torres and Princess Melody before opening the floor for discussion. Ryan stood and walked to the center of the room, and all eyes turned to him, and some were curious while others were openly hostile, and he cleared his throat and began to speak. "My name is Captain Ryan Torres, and I have fought the Luminari for 15 years, and I have killed hundreds of their people and destroyed dozens of their ships, and I have devoted my entire adult life to this war." He paused and let that sink in before continuing, "And I believed I was fighting for justice, and I believed the Luminari were monsters who deserved destruction, and I believed that peace was impossible as long as any of them still lived. But I was wrong," he said, and his voice grew stronger, "and I was wrong about the Luminari, and wrong about this war, and wrong about what honor and justice truly mean." He told them about capturing Princess Melody, and about learning the truth of how the war started, and about the intelligence report suggesting that many attacks on both sides were based on misunderstanding rather than malice. He described saving the dragons and seeing Melody's love for them and realizing that the Luminari felt the same emotions that humans did, and that they loved and feared and hoped just like any other beings. General Marcus Cole interrupted and shouted that Ryan was a traitor who had been seduced by the enemy, and that his testimony was worthless because he had clearly been compromised. Ryan met the general's angry gaze and said, "If caring about truth makes me a traitor, then I will wear that label with pride. And if refusing to kill innocents makes me weak, then I choose weakness over the kind of strength that requires me to ignore my conscience." Several human diplomats nodded, and Ryan could see that his words were reaching some of them, even if others remained hostile. Melody stood next and approached the center of the room, and her presence seemed to quiet the angry voices, and she radiated a calm dignity that commanded respect. "I am Princess Melody, daughter of Emperor Theron, and I have never wanted this war," she began. "And I have watched my people suffer and die, and I have carried the guilt of every life lost, and I have begged my father to seek peace, but he refused to listen until now." She explained that she had been traveling to this station in secret, against her father's orders, because she could no longer stand by while the killing continued, and she had risked disgrace and exile because peace was more important than her personal status. She told them about the bond between Luminari and dragons and how it made them deeply connected to all living things, and how this war had damaged not just their bodies but their souls. "When Captain Torres attacked my ship, I expected to die," she said, "and I expected him to show the same cruelty that I had heard all humans possessed. But instead, he showed mercy, and he saved my companions when he had every reason to let them die." She looked at Ryan, and her eyes glowed with emotion, and he showed me that hatred is not the only choice, and that even those who have suffered greatly can find the strength to forgive and to hope. Prince Aldrich stood abruptly and spoke in a cold, angry voice, and he accused his sister of shaming their family and betraying their people by fraternizing with the enemy. Melody turned to her brother and said, "I have not betrayed our people, and I have tried to save them from destroying themselves through endless war. And you call it betrayal when I refuse to hate, and you call it weakness when I choose compassion over vengeance." The two siblings stared at each other, and years of disagreement and frustration flowing between them. And finally Aldrich looked away and sat down without another word. Ambassador Korvax asked if anyone else wished to speak, and Dr. Lisa Chen stood and described the medical work she had done treating the dragons, and how intelligent and gentle they were. Commander Jeff Martinez talked about the crew members on Ryan's ship who had volunteered to support peace efforts, even though it meant going against everything they had been taught. Several human diplomats began asking questions, and they wanted to know specifics about how a ceasefire could work, and what guarantees there would be that neither side would use the peace to prepare for renewed conflict. Luminary counselors raised similar concerns and worried that humans would see any gesture of peace as an opportunity to attack. Ryan and Melody worked together to address each concern, and they proposed a gradual process starting with small ceasefires in specific regions and building trust slowly through verified actions rather than just promises. They suggested prisoner exchanges and joint humanitarian missions and shared scientific research, and all the small steps that could help both species see each other as people rather than monsters. Admiral Patricia Foster, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally stood and spoke, and she said that she had lost her son to a Luminari attack 5 years ago, and that her grief had made her support increasingly aggressive military actions. But watching Captain Torres and Princess Melody today, she continued, and I see something I had not seen in years, and I see hope, and I see two people who have every reason to hate each other, choosing instead to build bridges. She turned to the other human representatives and said, "We have been fighting this war for so long that we have forgotten why we started, and we have forgotten that our goal was supposed to be protecting our people, not destroying another species. If these two can find a way to work together," she said, gesturing at Ryan and Melody, "then perhaps there is hope for all of us." Her words seemed to break something in the room, and other voices joined in. And not everyone was convinced, but enough people were willing to consider the possibility of peace. The meeting continued for hours, and they debated details and argued over specifics, and several times it seemed like the whole thing would fall apart. But each time someone would look at Ryan and Melody standing together and remember that if a war hero and an enemy princess could find common ground, then maybe peace was possible after all. Finally, as exhaustion began to set in, Ambassador Korvax called for a preliminary vote, and he asked who among them was willing to support a temporary ceasefire in one sector as a test of whether peace negotiations could work. Hands went up slowly, and not all of them but more than half, and Ryan felt hope surge in his chest as he realized they had actually accomplished something. The ceasefire would begin in 2 weeks and would last for 30 days, and during that time both sides would pull back military forces and allow neutral observers to monitor the situation. It was a small step, but it was a beginning, and Ryan looked at Melody and saw tears of joy streaming down her face. They had done it, and they had taken the first step toward ending the war. The 30-day ceasefire began exactly as scheduled, and Ryan and Melody traveled to the designated sector to serve as observers and ensure both sides honored their commitments. And the region they chose was a contested border area where fighting had been particularly brutal and where trust was almost non-existent. They established a temporary base on a small moon that orbited between human and luminary-controlled space, and with them came a team of neutral observers from the Zentari species and medical personnel from both sides who would treat any civilians injured during previous fighting. The first week was tense, and both human and luminary forces watched each other across the border, with weapons ready and fingers hovering over triggers, and any small incident could have reignited the violence and destroyed the fragile peace. Ryan spent his days communicating with human commanders and trying to ease their fears, while Melody did the same with luminary officers, and many, on both sides, saw the ceasefire as a trick and expected the enemy to attack at any moment. Sky and Star helped more than Ryan had expected, and the dragons flew regular patrols along the border, and their presence seemed to calm tensions because they were clearly not taking sides, and instead they watched over everyone equally. Several times violence almost erupted, and once a young human soldier fired at what he thought was a luminary scout ship, and it turned out to be an automated cargo. Vessel and Melody managed to convince the luminary commanders that it was an accident and not a deliberate provocation. Another time, a group of luminary civilians tried to return to their homes in the contested zone, and human forces nearly opened fire before Ryan intervened and arranged safe passage. Each crisis was exhausting and required hours of negotiation and compromise, but each one they resolved without bloodshed made the next one slightly easier. By the second week, something unexpected began to happen, and soldiers on both sides started talking to each other, and at first it was just basic communications about patrol schedules and safe zones, but gradually the conversations became more personal. A human medic named Katie Brooks discovered she shared a love of poetry with a Luminari healer named Sylvanus, and they began exchanging verses across the communication channels. A human engineer named Tom Blake and a Luminari technician named Lyra started discussing mechanical problems they had both encountered and ended up collaborating on a solution that helped both sides. These small connections were more powerful than any treaty, and Ryan watched as people who had been trying to kill each other weeks ago slowly began to see each other as individuals with hopes and dreams and families waiting for them at home. Melody noticed it too, and she said to Ryan one evening that this was what she had always believed was possible, and that hate was learned but compassion was natural, and that given a chance people would always choose connection over violence. Ryan wanted to believe her, but he had seen too much cruelty to be entirely optimistic, and he worried that the moment the ceasefire ended, the killing would resume as if nothing had changed. His fears were not unfounded, and Admiral Patricia Foster contacted him during the third week with troubling news, and intelligence reports suggested that hardliners on both sides were planning attacks designed to sabotage the peace process. General Marcus Cole was apparently organizing a strike force to attack Luminari positions the moment the ceasefire ended, and similar reports indicated that Prince Aldrich, despite his sister's efforts, was preparing a massive assault on human colonies. Ryan and Melody called an emergency meeting with their observer teams and discussed what could be done, and they could try to expose the plots, but that might just accelerate the timeline and cause the attacks to happen. Sooner we need to extend the ceasefire, Melody said, and we need to show our governments that peace is working, and that attacking now would destroy something valuable. But how do we prove that? Ryan asked, and 30 days is not enough time to change. Centuries of hatred. Melody looked at Sky and Star, who were resting nearby. And then she turned back to Ryan with determination in her glowing eyes. And we need a grand gesture, and something that shows both our peoples that cooperation is possible, and that we are stronger together than apart. She proposed a joint humanitarian mission to a nearby planet that had been devastated by fighting, and the world called Haven's End had been home to both human and Luminari settlements before the war, and now it was abandoned and covered in ruins. If we could work together to rebuild even one village, Melody said, and if we could show humans and Luminari cooperating to create instead of destroy it, might change enough minds to extend the ceasefire. Ryan loved the idea but knew it would be dangerous, and hardliners on both sides would see it as treason, and anyone who participated would be taking enormous risks. He sent out a call for volunteers and expected only a handful of responses, but was shocked when over 100 people from both species signed up within hours. They included soldiers who were tired of fighting, and medics who wanted to heal instead of treating combat wounds, and engineers who wanted to build instead of designing weapons. Katie Brooks and Sylvanus volunteered immediately, along with Tom Blake and Lyra, and dozens of others who had made connections across the border during the ceasefire. The mission launched 1 week before the ceasefire was scheduled to end, and they took 3 transport ships filled with construction materials and medical supplies and farming equipment. Haven's End was even more devastated than the reports suggested, and entire cities had been reduced to rubble, and the land was scarred with craters and burn marks, and the air still smelled of smoke even though the fighting had ended months ago. But in the ruins, they found survivors and small groups of humans and Luminari who had refused to leave their homes and had been living in the wreckage and scrounging for food and medicine. These survivors were suspicious at first and could not believe that humans and Luminari were working together, and they expected betrayal or violence. But as they watched the volunteers clearing rubble and rebuilding homes and treating the sick, their suspicion slowly turned to cautious hope. Ryan worked alongside Luminari engineers to restore a water purification system, and he found himself laughing at jokes told by people he would have killed without hesitation. A month ago, Melody used her diplomatic skills to mediate disputes between survivors and organize the distribution of supplies, and her dragons helped move heavy materials and kept watch for any threats. Dr. Lisa Chen established a medical clinic that treated everyone regardless of species, and she trained local healers in new techniques that combined human and luminary medical knowledge. The work was hard and exhausting, but also deeply satisfying, and Ryan realized he had not felt this alive in years, and building something was so much more rewarding than destroying. News of the mission spread quickly, and media from both human and luminary worlds began covering the story, and images of humans and luminary working side by side were broadcast. Across countless planets, public opinion began to shift, and people who had supported the war started questioning whether it needed to continue, and parents who had lost children began asking if more death would truly honor their sacrifice. Admiral Patricia Foster contacted Ryan and said that the political situation was changing, and that moderates in the human government were gaining support, and that there was a real chance the ceasefire could be extended and possibly made permanent. Similar news came from the Luminary side, and Emperor Theron had been moved by seeing his daughter working alongside humans and had begun privately discussing peace terms with his counselors. But not everyone was pleased, and General Marcus Cole accused Ryan of treason and threatened to have him arrested if he returned to human space, and Prince Aldrich issued a formal challenge to his sister demanding she return home to face judgment. Ryan and Melody discussed their options and knew they could not hide forever, and eventually they would have to face the consequences of their choices. "I am ready to face whatever comes," Melody said, "and even if my father strips me of my title and exiles me, I will not regret what we have done." Ryan took her hand and said, "Then we face it together, and if they call us traitors for choosing peace over war, then I can live with that." The final week of the ceasefire arrived, and the village they had been rebuilding was nearly complete, and survivors who had been living in ruins now had solid homes and clean water and enough food to last through the coming season. On the last day, volunteers from both sides gathered for a ceremony, and they planted a tree in the center of the village as a symbol of new growth and hope. Katie Brooks read a poem about peace that brought tears to many eyes, and Sylvanus responded with a luminary song that spoke of healing and forgiveness. As the ceremony ended, Ryan and Melody stood together watching the sunset paint. The sky in shades of gold and purple, and Sky and Star flew overhead, performing aerial displays that delighted the children below. "This is what victory looks like," Melody said softly, "and not conquest or domination, but people living together and building together." Ryan nodded and realized she was right, and he had spent 15 years pursuing the wrong kind of victory, and had wasted so much time on revenge when he could have been working toward something better. The next day they received word that both governments had agreed to extend the ceasefire indefinitely, and that formal peace negotiations would begin within the month.